It's a pleasure to be here talking to you today about our report. Thank you so much for coming along. Very excited to share our insights with all of you. By way of background as to what motivated us to do this report, the McKinsey Global Institute, which is the economics and research think tank of McKinsey, has been looking at the issue of automation and its impacts globally for the last 3 years with a very, very deep and rigorous research program, and has published extensively on this topic. And as Australia was approaching sort of 30 years of continuous economic growth, with some kind of headwinds starting to emerge, we thought this would be a really great time to apply this research to Australia to see what are the opportunities, but also what some of the challenges could be. And that was the sort of motivation for the partners of McKinsey Australia funding and championing this research. There's 4 key messages coming out of our research that I want to touch on today. The first is that Australia is at an interesting moment in time where, although we are approaching that 30 years of continuous economic growth, there are headwinds, and certainly the pace and quality of that growth is not what it once was. Which brings us to the potential role that automation can play as a positive force to help extend that boom, restart productivity growth, and create a more inclusive economic growth model. Of course, there will also be challenges. Automation will be disruptive like other waves of structural reform before, and we will talk about that. I won't shy away from discussing what those challenges are. But the final message that I will want to leave you with is that we at McKinsey and as the co-authors of the report believe that there is a win-win scenario possible for Australia where we both capture the benefits of automation for the country as a whole, but also ensure that those benefits are broadly shared across the Australian workforce. And we outline some ideas to how to bring about that win-win scenario, which won't magically happen on its own, but with the collective efforts of government, business, educators, a lot of the people in this room, we believe that win-win scenario is possible. So the first thing we did was we looked at how the Australian economy was faring, and we sort of essentially did a diagnostic of the last 30 years of economic growth. And what we found is while Australia navigated the global financial crisis better than almost any other advanced economy in the world, and we didn't go into a recession and we kept growing, the pace and the nature of the growth changed quite significantly after the global financial crisis, such that if you compare the third decade of the boom, i.e. the last 10 years, to the preceding 2 decades, you find very different results. First, the overall pace of growth has been lower, by about a third, and income growth has basically been almost non-existent. So we're continuing to grow at a slower pace, but that growth is no longer producing kind of tangible benefits to ordinary Australians. And among the factors for that is that the drivers of growth have shifted from kind of sustainable factors like productivity growth to less sustainable factors, whether that be population growth, mining boom, increasing household debt to fund consumption. Those are all sources of growth that are important, but not ultimately sustainable forever. There's only so far households can leverage to maintain consumption and other kind of growth. Obviously, one of the key factors that has been driving down kind of growth, both the quality and the pace, has been productivity, which has also fallen by about a third in the last decade compared to the 2 preceding decades. And given the strong historical link between productivity and income growth, essentially, wage growth, it's not surprising that wage growth in turn has come down. However, the other surprising finding is that it's actually decelerated a lot more than productivity has, which suggests at least a short-term decoupling between that historical relationship between productivity and wage growth and income growth. Lots of people have speculated as to the causes of that: globalization, increasing technological adoption, shifting relative powers between corporations and workers. There's lots of factors that could be at play. It's worth pointing out these kind of decouplings have occurred in the past, and then the relationship has come back. Definitely bears watching. I think the main conclusion that we take away from this is it's important to reignite productivity growth as sort of a basic condition for long-term sustainable wage growth, but it's also important to ensure that indeed workers do get a share of the gains that come from productivity growth. Which sort of tees up what could be the role of automation in helping reignite that productivity growth and in turn wage growth. So I mean, our overall perspective here is that automation actually holds great promise and could be kind of actually a big unlock to kind of productivity renaissance and rekindling the kind of growth that delivers sort of better living standards for Australia, higher wages, more consumer choices, higher standard of life and quality of living. Now, automation will do that by essentially freeing up a lot of resources in the economy that are currently doing kind of lower value add, routine, repetitive tasks. And based on the methodologies developed by the McKinsey Global Institute, we estimate that that potential for Australia could range anywhere between 25% in a sort of midpoint adoption scenario to up to 46% in a rapid automation adoption scenario. So huge impact potentially on kind of the way that the economy is currently producing goods and services. And in terms of what the benefits from that would be, well, they are potentially enormous. Starting with productivity, a boost to the annual rate of productivity growth of anywhere between 50% to up to 150% if Australia adopts automation technologies very rapidly. That could in turn add up to $600 billion per year to the Australian economy, and most importantly, put up to $15,000 per year into the pockets of ordinary Australian workers, which is, to put that in proportional terms, a potential 25% increase than what it would otherwise be in 2030. So this is potentially very large and meaningful opportunity, not just for the economy as a whole, but for individual workers, provided, of course, that the gains are shared with workers. Which gets me to sort of some of the challenges and potential disruptions. I think there's no sort of shying away from the fact that automation, like many other previous waves of structural and technological change, will be disruptive. It will destroy some jobs, it will create many others, but I think it will also change profoundly almost every other job, regardless of whether it's a new or existing job. And in some ways, this is not unprecedented for Australia. We've seen this with the embrace of globalization, with the embrace of the internet and technology. So we've done this before, and we've done it relatively successfully in a relatively inclusive way. And therefore, I think we can be confident that with a concerted effort, we can achieve that positive scenario again. However, those positive scenarios will not magically happen on their own. You know, automation as an exogenous technological force is not going to be inherently benign in and of itself. And if we just leave it to its own devices, it does have the potential to cause painful disruptions, a few of which are highlighted on the current slide. So while overall we are confident the economy will return to and maintain full equilibrium employment, there could be significant sort of disruptions, particularly during the transition period. And there could be consequences to those if they're not carefully managed. So for example, anywhere between 1.8 to 5 million people, again, depending on that mid to rapid pace of automation, may have to not only change jobs, but actually change their entire occupation or profession in order to find a new job. So this is not just a question of somebody transitioning from being a payroll clerk at a bank to being a payroll clerk at a retail company, but this is a payroll clerk reskilling and potentially becoming a disability support worker in a different sector. So complete kind of occupation shifts in order to find a new job and return to employment. Given the likelihood of increasing churn in the job market, there is a risk of higher unemployment during that transition phase. And depending on the pace of that automation, but also how flexible our labour markets remain, the increase in unemployment could be as high as about 2 percentage points. So that means, put that in relative terms, an increase from about 5% unemployment rate to about a 7% unemployment rate during the peak of the transition, which we, in our models, see happening around the middle of the next decade, so around 2025. And then finally, automation, again left to its own devices, has the potential to increase income inequality by almost 30%. And that arises because the impacts of automation will be uneven across different skill sets. They will, relatively speaking, on average, hit lower skill, lower paid workers harder, whereas they will favour more job creation for higher skilled, higher paid workers. And those converging wage pressures, left to their own devices and all other things being equal, could mean higher income inequality. And also to put that sort of 27-30% figure in context, Australia today has pretty average income inequality by the standards of advanced economies. We're in the middle of the pack. The highest inequality advanced country is about the US. This increase of about 30% would take Australia from where it is today to about the level that the US is today. So it would be a significant change in the level of income inequality in Australia, which obviously would entail social and political consequences. That's sort of speaking at the aggregate level. The other challenge that Australia will need to navigate is that a lot of these distributional challenges that I've just spoken about are going to be uneven. They're going to be uneven across sectors, they're going to be uneven across different parts of Australia, they're going to be uneven across different skill sets. So starting with the sector, there's going to be a variation with some sectors much more automatable, essentially, than others, sort of led by transport and warehousing at the top. Manufacturing, mining also features prominently. The other end of the spectrum, relatively human-centric sectors or very professional sectors, whether that's education, health, social services, and professional services, are relatively less vulnerable to automation. And that will lead to kind of a change in the overall distribution of jobs in the economy, which in turn will require a lot of reskilling of people to match them to the new jobs that are being created. There will also be variations geographically across Australia, both in terms of different parts of the country, as well as often within metropolitan areas as well. So in terms of the overall parts of the country, given the sort of concentration of mining and construction in certain regions of the country, you see that certain regions like the East Pilbara in Western Australia or Mackay in Northern Queensland are relatively more vulnerable to automation, with automation rates sort of at or around 30%. The other end of the spectrum, our city centres, whether that's in Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane or Perth, have relatively low automation potential rates of closer to 20%, because that's where the concentration of the highest skilled, human-centric and creative jobs are. However, there will also be big variation within the metropolitan areas. If you compare Sydney city centre with an automation rate of about 20% to Penrith, which is in outer Western Sydney, a rate of 27%, it's a stark difference, and that's replicated across most of the metropolitan areas in Australia. And that reflects the different distribution of jobs even within the same sectors. So whereas the banking jobs in central Sydney are the sort of potentially the managers and the higher skilled professionals, the banking jobs in the suburbs are typically more retail or routine jobs that are more automated. Again, that'll have challenges for how we think about where workers are living in cities and how to get them to the places where the new jobs will be. And then finally, there'll be a different impact on skills, with automation favouring increasing demand for certain skill sets, especially around technology, which is quite intuitive, as well as social and emotional skills, because a lot of the new jobs that will be created will either be very human-centric, so in areas like education, health, social services, or because a lot of the jobs will require effectively translators between the technology and consumers. Of course, at the other end of the spectrum, automation will lead to a net increase, most likely, in the demand for physical and manual jobs, as well as skills, as well as for sort of the basic routine cognitive skills. And so again, huge pressure to ensure that our education system is upgrading the skills of workers and helping them build the skills that are going to be in demand in the future. As I mentioned right at the front, we are optimistic, and we think that it's very possible for Australia to achieve a positive win-win scenario. Of course, this will require a lot of foresight and leadership from all sectors of society and all sectors of the economy, and that if they work together, we strongly believe that there's an opportunity to both capture the benefits, manage the transition, and ensure that the benefits are broadly shared. And this will require kind of simultaneous efforts on two fronts. On the one hand, employers and the government and other stakeholders need to do everything that they can to actually accelerate the pace of automation. At the same time, working together to ensure that they implement effective policies to help workers transition and to ensure that the gains from automation are broadly shared. And if we're able to move successfully on both fronts simultaneously, we will end up in the sort of top right quadrant, which we call sort of the win-win scenario, where there's a sort of productivity renaissance, our firms remain competitive both domestically and globally, and Australian workers receive higher incomes. Frankly speaking, all three other scenarios are not palatable. We wouldn't want any one of them. If we only automate without doing anything to help workers, we're going to leave workers behind, and that's not likely to be politically sustainable. If we only try and sort of implement policies to redistribute income, we're either going to be stagnating or fighting over a shrinking kind of pie. And so, frankly speaking, I don't think any of those are sustainable, certainly not in the long run. And so we think it's imperative that Australia really aim and shoot for that win-win inclusive scenario. And in our report, we lay out 10 ideas spread across those two axes of accelerating automation and ensuring that the growth is inclusive to help Australia navigate towards that win-win scenario. On the accelerating productivity side, there's a big role for government as the kind of steward of the overall economy and the determinant of the rules and the regulations to kind of help jumpstart the productivity agenda and ensure that the economy has the right incentives in place for companies to invest in R&D, invest in new automation technologies, and to adopt them and kind of boost their overall efficiency and competitiveness. Then, of course, at the individual employer level, and that could be both in the public or private sector, there's going to be the painstaking effort at the organizational level of developing the strategies and plans to implement automation at the organization level and to ensure that they have the skills in the workforces with the skills to implement that plan and to capture the benefits from it. On the second axis around sort of ensuring inclusive and productive growth, there's going to be roles here for both government, employers, and the education sector to help those workers invest in new skills and retrain. Organizations may need to play a role in thinking about the future of their workforce even beyond their organization. If there's a world where there's going to be a large churn of workers, what responsibility, actually this could be a good question to pick up in the panel, do employers have to workers who may no longer be needed in their own organization, but could be valuable in other organizations and other sectors, and what is their responsibility compared to government to help their workers prepare for that transition. And then finally, while there's lots of great ideas out there about universal basic income and other such sort of innovative ideas, I feel like Australia is a long, long way away from needing those kind of ideas, but certainly there's room to look at them and start piloting them and have them in the back pocket for the future. But in the short run, I think there's lots of work that could be done in terms of optimizing transition support, employment services that could help workers transition, given that Australia has a relatively good track record in this area. I'll leave it with that, and I think we'll pick up a lot of these policy ideas on the panel. Thanks for listening and enjoy your lunch.